Rick Grenell is joining us, our Senior Advisor for National Security and Foreign Policy. I specifically wanted to get Rick on to comment. Let me play the soundbite for you again. This is Admiral Kirby, the Department of Defense spokesperson, announcing it this morning. Take a listen.
As part of this commitment and to be prepared for a range of contingencies, the United States will soon move additional forces to Romania, Poland, and Germany. I want to be very clear about something. These are not permanent moves. They are moves designed to respond to the current security environment. Moreover, these forces are not going to fight in Ukraine. They are going to ensure the robust defense of our NATO allies.
So, Rick, I go right to this question, and so did every reporter in that room, but I like your response. Is every reporter asks, why are we going when NATO has not been stood up yet, and NATO has not yet? So we're doing this for NATO. I mean, 3,000 troops right now is not a match for the 100,000 on the border. So, and he's saying they're not going to fight in Ukraine. But what is it? What is this doing? Or is it just some kind of action by the administration to look like they're doing something? Because they keep beating the war drum when the rest of the world says stop.
They're moving troops into Eastern and Central Europe. Think about that. We are pushing diplomacy aside. Let me state one fact. The U.S. ambassador to NATO is a State Department employee. The NATO team reports to the State Department. Yes, they coordinate with the Pentagon, but it is a diplomatic post. It is used to further diplomacy. What I don't understand is why all of Washington is pushing aside the State Department and beating a drum towards troops on the ground. Look, we're trapped into this whole process in Washington, D.C., where every time there's a crisis, we put forward military, Pentagon, boots on the ground options. We have dismissed the State Department. We've allowed our diplomats to be very weak. When a diplomat is strong and tough and uses diplomacy with muscle, they're mocked as being undiplomatic. And I would argue that our diplomats are what ensures that we don't have war. You need to have diplomacy with muscle in order to get things done. I'll finish with this. Why in the world do we not have sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? The pipeline is not up and running. You want to change the Russian behavior, sanction their money pit and their influence, and that is the pipeline.
You know, Rick, I mentioned this the other day when we were on. I mentioned it a couple of times, and that is Benjamin Disraeli, the famed prime minister of Great Britain, in dealing with Russia, used the phrase diplomacy as war. That acts of diplomacy with power behind it can, in fact, be war because you're getting a desired change. The question here is, and this is what I'm trying to wrestle with. I know Colonel Smith is having trouble. We're all trying to wrestle with this. Is that there does not seem to be a plan in place, and it seems like the rest of Europe is saying to the United States, we don't want you to do this. Why are you doing this? NATO hasn't stood up its troops. The Germans, as you said, and you were the ambassador to Germany, they don't want any part of this, and they're one of the biggest NATO partners. So what's the point of what we're doing here?
It is typical of Joe Biden and the Washington creatures, where when there's a crisis, the only thing they can think of is sending U.S. troops. Look what our U.S. troops have done over the last 20 years. They've literally been feeding children. They have gone into schools. They're trying to win hearts and minds. That's not the purpose of our military. However, what we've done is we've shoved diplomats aside. We have a whole bunch of State Department career Foreign Service officers who don't know how to negotiate, who are afraid to go into danger posts. I would say that what we need to do is literally redo the State Department, try to force change in Washington, D.C., so that when there is a crisis, let's try all the forms of diplomacy. Let's use trade. Let's use commerce. Let's use sanctions. Let's use NATO. Let's use the UN. The UN is not great. It's not perfect. But when there is a U.S. leadership, you might be able to get something done. And so I just think that we've shoved Blinken and Wendy Sherman aside because they obviously are super weak, and even Biden doesn't rely on them. And all we do is just come up with more war options.
You know, Rick, without preemptive sanctions before he invades Ukraine, and without sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and getting Germany to stand with the other European nations which wants to stand against Russia, without those two things, is there any deterrence for Putin to invade and take over Ukraine?
It's such a great question. I mean, deterrence is about strength and changing the behavior of the other side. So the Russians clearly have a green light when they were given Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The Germans aren't paying their NATO obligation. They're stopping Estonia from bringing hardware in. They're undermining NATO at every turn. We allow them to do it. Joe Biden is trapped into thinking that the Germans are all of Europe. He can't think about Poland or Italy or other countries within the EU that want to do something different. The European Parliament was against Nord Stream 2, and yet Joe Biden stands up and says, well, I'm doing what Europe wants. That's not what Europe wants. It's what Germany wants. It's what the current government in Germany wants. I think that the reality is that every American needs to understand is that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is not up and running yet. And yet there are no sanctions on it. And the Biden administration and the Democrats all worked hard to make sure that the sanctions wouldn't be implemented.
I want to go to Than Bennett, our Director of Governmental Affairs in Washington, because Than, Rick's point is that the real sanctions have not been put in place, the preemptive sanctions here. What is the sense in Washington on the Hill right now about this?
Rick's absolutely correct on this, Jay. I mean, there was a full toolbox for the administration to engage in sanctions, but then they had another opportunity. They could have said, look, we didn't want to engage in sanctions, but the United States Senate forced us. Those sanctions that Rick is talking about, we've referenced them several times, but the American people just have to understand what happened. They were on the floor of the Senate 3 weeks ago under the sponsorship of Ted Cruz, and they had the support to pass. They had bipartisan support to pass. And, Jay, the reason they didn't pass is because the White House, President Biden, and President Putin teamed together to say to Senate Democrats, filibuster those sanctions so that they don't pass because we don't want to have to deal with them. We don't have to sign them. Jay, I actually don't think that that bill was probably necessary to begin the preemptive sanctions, but it certainly was a way for the United States Senate to sort of force the president's hand. They didn't do it. They stood down, and they stood down because of President Biden and President Putin.
So we talked about ways to prevent this, but Rick, the Biden administration just seems like this is a done deal. Like, this is happening. There's an invasion going on. It's going to happen at some point. And every day they're doing some other move to signal that. And you said, and not really talking about the diplomatic side. Is there still a way out of this? I mean, it seems like Russia hasn't fully committed to 100% doing this, and they're still waiting to see. But I still get very nervous that they're not explaining to the American people what the real purposes are. I mean, and also that why NATO can't be stood up here if that's the real concern.
Yeah, first, NATO should be utilized. You don't need to draw back. We just had 4 years of Trump where you put America first and you asked our allies to do more. Now Joe Biden rushes in to have America do, the first option and not utilize NATO. Look, let's remember that when Joe Biden had his call with President Zelensky of the Ukraine, Joe Biden said specifically that Ukraine should not expect any more sanctions on Russia, nor any more help with hardware, military hardware, unless Russia invades. President Zelensky of Ukraine responded to Joe Biden and said, this is a disaster policy. It's the worst of both worlds.